Frontier women were left to die tortured until Sioux warriors found them and saved them. The skies above the Dakota Territory hung heavy with storm clouds as Sarah Mitchell tugged her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders. 3 days had passed since the attack on their wagon train. 3 days since the band of outlaws had separated the women from the men, robbed them of all valuables, and left the women bound to trees on this desolate stretch of prairie while the men were taken elsewhere. The bitter wind cut through her clothing, chilling her to the bone as night approached once again. "Hold on, Mary," Sarah whispered to her sister-in-law, whose head lolled against the rough bark of the oak. Mary's lips were cracked from dehydration, her wrists raw and bloody from the ropes that bound her. "Just a little longer. Someone will find us." The words sounded hollow even to her own ears, but she couldn't surrender to despair, not when the others looked to her for strength. Beside them, the older woman, Mrs. Abernathy, had stopped responding altogether. The beginnings of fever flushed her cheeks after a bullet had grazed her shoulder during their capture. Her labored breathing worried Sarah more with each passing hour. 5 women in total, left to die a slow death under the merciless sun and frigid night air. No water, no food. Their captors had been methodical in their cruelty, placing them just within sight of a small creek they couldn't reach. The sound of flowing water had become a torment worse than any physical pain. "I can hear the water," whispered Elizabeth, the youngest among them at 16. Her golden hair, once carefully pinned, now hung in tangled disarray around her dirt-streaked face. "Please, someone help us." Her voice carried no further than the tall grass that surrounded them. The older women had stopped trying to comfort her after the first day. What comfort could they offer when their own hopes diminished with each sunset? Sarah had been counting days by watching the sun's path. 3 rotations, 3 full days of desperate prayers and fading hope as their strength ebbed. They had tried everything to free themselves, twisting against the ropes until their skin tore, reaching for sharp rocks with their fingertips, calling out until their voices grew hoarse. Nothing had worked. Sarah's fingers had long since gone numb, and she could no longer feel the rough fibers of the rope that bound her wrists. Catherine, the 5th woman, had been silent since yesterday, conserving what little energy remained in her emaciated frame. Her husband had been the first to fall during the attack, shot through the heart as he tried to defend the wagons. Perhaps she was already preparing to join him in the hereafter. On the morning of the 4th day, Sarah awoke to the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Her heart leaped, then plummeted. If the outlaws had returned, it could only mean more suffering. She straightened her back against the tree as best she could, determined to face whatever came with dignity. Through bleary eyes, she made out the silhouettes of mounted warriors on the ridge. Sioux by the look of their dress and the distinctive feathers that adorned some of their heads. The rising sun silhouetted their forms, making them appear almost otherworldly. Sarah had heard the stories told around campfires, tales meant to frighten settlers about the savage Indians who roamed these lands. But in this moment, facing certain death tied to a tree, she felt no fear, only a desperate hope. The warriors approached cautiously, their horses stepping lightly through the tall grass. The leader, a broad-shouldered man with 2 eagle feathers in his hair and intricate designs painted across his chest, dismounted and approached Sarah. His face remained impassive as he surveyed the 5 women. He spoke in his native tongue to his companions, and Sarah caught the word Wasiku, white people. "Please," Sarah croaked, her voice barely audible after days without water, "help us." The leader studied her face, looking deep into her eyes as if searching for something. Then he drew a knife from his belt, the blade catching the morning light. Sarah closed her eyes, uncertain of what would come next. The sharp blade sliced through her bindings, and her arms fell limply to her sides, numb from days of restricted circulation. The pain of returning blood flow was excruciating, but Sarah bit back her cry. One by one, the warriors freed the women. The leader instructed 2 younger warriors to bring water from the creek. They returned with carved wooden cups, and with gentle hands helped the women drink. Sarah had never tasted anything so sweet as that first sip of water. She had to be restrained from drinking too quickly, which might have made her sick after such prolonged dehydration. "I am called Arrow," the leader said in halting English, touching his chest. These men who did this, not good men. They attacked our wagon train, Sarah managed, her voice stronger after the water, took the men, left us here. She didn't need to elaborate on what they had endured. The evidence was written on their bodies and in their haunted eyes. Called Arrow nodded grimly. We found men. 2 days from here. His expression told Sarah everything she needed to know. There would be no reunion with her husband. She closed her eyes briefly, allowing a single tear to escape before composing herself again. There would be time for mourning later. If they survived, Mrs. Abernathy moaned softly as one of the warriors examined her wound. The bullet graze had become infected, the skin around it angry and inflamed. The warrior spoke quickly to Called Arrow in their native tongue, gesturing to the wound and shaking his head with concern. Called Arrow translated, "She needs medicine. Our village not far. We have healer, wise woman who knows plants, cures." The women exchanged uncertain glances. Going to a Sioux village went against everything they'd been warned about since childhood. Stories of captives who never returned haunted pioneer communities. But they had no choice. Mrs. Abernathy would die without help, and the rest of them weren't far behind. "We will go with you," Sarah decided, speaking for the group as she had often done during their westward journey. "Thank you for your kindness." The words felt inadequate for what these strangers had done, saving them when their own kind had left them to die. 2 warriors helped Sarah onto a horse, her legs too weak to support her weight. Elizabeth rode with one of the younger warriors, while Mary and Catherine were assisted onto separate mounts. Mrs. Abernathy, the most severely injured, was carefully placed on a travois fashioned from branches and hide. As they rode away from the scene of their torment, Sarah looked back once at the trees that had nearly become their graves. The ropes that had bound them now lay discarded on the ground, symbols of a fate they had narrowly escaped. The Sioux village sat in a protected valley beside a flowing river, the conical shapes of dozens of teepees arranged in a traditional circle. Women paused in their work as the warriors returned with the strangers, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Children peeked from behind their mothers' skirts, pointing and whispering at the unusual sight of white women entering their camp. An elderly woman, her face deeply lined with age and wisdom, immediately took charge of Mrs. Abernathy, barking orders that sent younger women scurrying for supplies. She led them to a teepee where healing herbs already hung in bundles, their pungent scent filling the air. The healer worked with practiced efficiency, cleaning Mrs. Abernathy's wound with a herbal infusion before applying a poultice of crushed plants. Sarah, Mary, Elizabeth, and Catherine were taken to another teepee, where women of the tribe brought them clean water, soft buckskin clothing, and a stew rich with meat and wild roots. They ate slowly, their bodies unaccustomed to nourishment after days of starvation. The Sioux women watched them with compassion, communicating through gestures when words failed. Over the following weeks, the frontier women regained their strength. They learned that Called Arrow's band had been tracking the outlaws for days, men who had been raiding both white settlements and native villages alike, leaving destruction in their wake. These weren't the stereotypical Indian raiders of frontier tales, but white men exploiting the tensions between settlers and indigenous people for their own gain. The warriors had found the men from the wagon train already beyond help, executed by the outlaws after being forced to reveal where they had hidden additional valuables. Sarah mourned her husband in the Sioux way, sitting alone on a nearby hilltop at dawn, facing the rising sun as she said her final goodbye. As autumn progressed toward winter, the frontier women found themselves integrated into the daily life of the village. Sarah watched as Mary taught several Sioux children English words, while they taught her their language in return. The children's laughter as they practiced pronunciation became a healing balm for Mary's grief over losing her husband, Sarah's brother. Elizabeth, always quick to learn, helped the women prepare hides, quickly mastering the techniques they showed her. Her nimble fingers soon produced work that earned approving nods from the most skilled craftswomen in the tribe. The nightmares that had plagued her since the attack gradually subsided as she found purpose in her new daily routines. Mrs. Abernathy, slowly recovering from her wound, shared her knowledge of plants with the tribe's healer. Despite the language barrier, the two women found common ground in their mutual respect for nature's remedies. They spent hours together gathering herbs, each learning from the other's expertise. Catherine, who had been the most withdrawn, found solace in caring for the tribe's children. Her own child had been stillborn the previous winter, and the pain of that loss had never fully healed. Now, as she helped mothers with their little ones, something in her broken spirit began to mend. As for Sarah, she found herself spending time with Called Arrow, learning about his people's way of life, their profound connection to the land, their spiritual beliefs, their system of governance so different from what she had known. She discovered that many of the stories she'd been told about the Sioux were distortions or outright fabrications, meant to justify the taking of their lands. One evening, as they sat by the communal fire, watching the flames dance against the darkening sky, Called Arrow asked her, "What will you do when spring comes?" "Go back to white settlements." Sarah looked around at the community that had saved them, that had shown them kindness when they had been left to die by their own kind. She watched Elizabeth laughing with a group of young women as they worked on a beaded dress. She saw Mary with the children, now able to communicate in basic Lakota. Mrs. Abernathy and the healer were sorting through the day's gathered plants, while Catherine cradled a sleeping infant whose mother was busy with chores. "I don't know," she admitted. "We have no family waiting for us. The life we were headed toward no longer exists." The homestead they had planned to establish with their husbands was now an impossible dream. Called Arrow nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes the path we walk changes. New path opens." He gestured toward the sky, where stars were beginning to appear, like stream that finds new way when rocks fall. As winter blanketed the Dakota Territory in snow, the 5 women who had been strangers to this land and its people found themselves embraced by the tribe. They contributed what skills they had: Sarah's knowledge of reading and writing, Mary's talent for music, Elizabeth's quick mind, Mrs. Abernathy's medicinal wisdom, and Catherine's gentle way with children. In return, they learned survival skills that no frontier guidebook could have taught them: how to read weather patterns in cloud formations, how to track game through dense forest, how to identify plants that could heal or harm. Most importantly, they learned that humanity transcended the artificial boundaries of race and culture that had seemed so impenetrable before. When spring finally arrived, melting the snow and bringing new life to the plains, the 5 women who had been left to die faced a choice. The nearest white settlement was a week's journey away. Called Arrow offered warriors to escort them safely if they wished to return to the world they knew, or they could stay with the people who had saved them. Mrs. Abernathy, her wound fully healed thanks to the tribe's healer, chose to return, eager to reunite with her grandchildren back east. "I'm too old to change my ways completely," she told Sarah, "but I'll take what I've learned here and share the truth about these people when I return." Elizabeth and Mary decided to stay, having found new purpose among the Sioux people. Elizabeth had begun a courtship with a young warrior who treated her with a respect she'd never known from the young men in her hometown. Mary had become an honorary mother to 2 orphaned children whose parents had been killed in a raid by the same outlaws who had attacked the wagon train. Catherine, after much soul-searching, chose to accompany Mrs. Abernathy. "There's a sister waiting for me in St. Louis," she explained, "but I'll carry this place in my heart forever." "And Sarah?" She stood at the edge of the village, watching as riders from a neighboring band arrived for the spring gathering. The women's colorful dresses and the men's impressive headdresses created a vibrant spectacle against the green prairie. Called Arrow approached, respectful of her space, his face betraying nothing of his hopes or fears regarding her decision. "Your decision?" he asked simply. Sarah smiled, the weight of her past finally lifting from her shoulders. "I'm staying. This is where my new path leads." She had found not just safety among the Sioux, but a sense of belonging she had never experienced in the rigid confines of frontier society. Called Arrow's expression remained composed, but his eyes revealed his pleasure at her choice. "Good. Winter is easier when shared with friends." Sarah knew there would be challenges ahead. The tensions between settlers and native peoples would not disappear, and her choice placed her in an uncertain position between 2 worlds. But as she watched Mrs. Abernathy and Catherine depart with their escort, She felt no regret, only a profound gratitude for the second chance at life she had been given. The frontier had taken much from these women, their husbands, their security, nearly their lives. But in the end, it had also given them something unexpected, a chance to discover strength they never knew they possessed, and allies in those they had once been taught to fear. For Sarah, Mary, and Elizabeth, this new beginning among the Sioux offered something that had eluded them on their westward journey. Not just survival, but the promise of truly living in harmony with the land and its first peoples.